For this lesson, we're going to start by looking at our cross-cut sequence of scenes 39 through 46. We've applied some visual stylization to the flashback scenes in this section to really help the audience understand that these moments are flashbacks and are not continuous with the rest of our present-day scenes. Check out what we did.
It's like I belonged to Pa.
Marie, stop it.
Your hair is like seriously all over the place. Like you look like you just woke up every morning.
Yeah. So I've been
All day
told.
long.
Yeah.
Like you just rolled out of bed.
No.
What?
I'm smiling at.
I'm not smiling. Okay, I have one. Knock knock. Good one. Stop. Alex.
Alright, so that's great. Actually, it's not. It's interesting, but I wouldn't necessarily call it great. There are several big problems here. First, and most importantly, the problem is that it's far too intense for this moment. In fact, all of this is actually quite distracting. When implementing the kind of stylization work that goes into making a flashback look and feel like a flashback, it's important to remember where you and your characters are in the story. At this point in the film, the audience will have already experienced the flashback scene. And so, if we were going to do this kind of stylization, we'd want to refer back to the earlier section of the film and reference the look that we created there, and see maybe if it makes sense to apply to this moment as well. So let's jump backward in time to just a few scenes earlier where Alex is showering after huffing paint. He falls in the shower and hits his head, where he then passes out in the bathtub. This sort of moment is a bit more befitting of stylization, as it's a flashback that's partially drug-induced, and it's also partially the result of being knocked unconscious. So some kind of visual flair might make the moment clearer for the audience. Alright, so we've created 4 different flashback styles here for you to take a look at, and we're going to walk you through each one of them. One note, these styles are very graphics or visual effects intensive. We're going to be generalizing the techniques that we used here so that you can choose the appropriate effect in your own application. Your results might not match ours exactly because our compositing tool of choice is After Effects. Although most NLEs do have enough capability to create most of these styles with some modifications. The first style that we're going to look at is all about blurring the image. Let's check it out.
$223.
You'll notice that this flashback style relies heavily on blurring the image. So let's take a look at how to build a compelling blur over the image and the various ways that you can craft that look. In the first shot of Alex in the tub, we blurred the image in and out as if he were beginning to lose consciousness. Now, before we go into further detail, let me make an important distinction here. There are 2 types of blurs. There's your basic blur, which looks like this, and then there's often a defocus effect, which looks like this. Let me show you both side by side. The difference here has to do with the way that the image is being blurred. A basic blur, commonly referred to as a Gaussian blur, looks more soupy and less defined, while a defocus effect, or the type of blur that emulates what a camera lens would be doing, will attempt to create bokeh, or those little bubbles that appear in the background of out-of-focus shots. Let me show you one more time using an even clearer example. First, we'll blur this image, and then we'll defocus it. You can clearly see here that our defocusing effect, or camera lens blur, is attempting to create the little bubbles of out-of-focus elements. It's entirely up to you what type of blur you use, but if you're going for subtlety and realism, you might start with a defocus effect first, as that's going to more closely emulate the way a camera lens actually works. So in this shot here, we added a defocus and then we applied some keyframes. The value increases pretty dramatically once or twice before going back to normal. And then we cranked up the value very high to create a sort of blur transition. In this next shot, we did something very similar using a defocusing effect. However, this time we wanted the blur to have a little bit more control. So we used a mask or a matte to isolate the blur to just one part of the shot. Every software will handle this technique a little bit differently, so you'll need to create a mask using whatever tools you have available to you in your program. Before you create a mask with your blur, I want to come back to this shot in the convenience store one more time to discuss masks and blurs. So I'm going to go ahead and blur this image using my basic blur, commonly referred to as a Gaussian blur like we said before. The image becomes kind of soupy looking. And now I want to isolate Alex here, so I'm going to go ahead and create a mask around him to tell my blur to avoid this area. And you can see that it doesn't look very realistic or very good. So we can feather the mask and that should help. Yeah, that's looking better. But there's a problem. In the area between where the mask is invisible and the mask is fully visible, there's a faded section where the blur is turning on. This is creating an odd look, where you can see sharp areas of focus underneath the blur. It's not very realistic to how a camera lens would actually photograph a scene. Check out some of these examples and notice how the focus looks in them. So I'm going to swap this for a defocus effect, and I'm going to create that mask again. With most defocus effects, you might find an option to use the mask or some kind of guide layer as a blur map. This will tell the effect where to start with sharp focus, and that it should get progressively more out of focus as it nears the edge of the mask or the guide layer. So now you can see that the focus seems to go from sharp all the way to blurry, but without any of that strange blending going on. However, that blending might work for the style that you're going for, just as it did in the example that we looked at from Atonement back in the flashbacks and dream sequences lesson. Now, back to our footage of Alex underwater. Here, we've created a defocus effect, we've used a mask to isolate it to one area, and we've added some keyframes to the mask to make it larger and smaller. This gives the effect that the focus is shifting. Eventually, the mask shrinks down to just cover Alex's eyes to really focus in on them. The rest of our shots from this scene feature similar focus effects and a variety of animations for them. This shot intentionally uses the blur effect and a mask, as we wanted to achieve that strange feeling focus from Atonement. Alright, so in our second attempt to stylize the flashbacks from this scene, we leaned heavily on overlays and lens flares.
$223.
You can see that we combined two different techniques here. First are some bright lens flares, and second are some flashy overlays with things like light leaks, film burns, and some sparkly lens orbs. So let's break this all down. In the first shot, just after Alex hits his head in the tub, he falls backwards. We created a lens flare for this moment to suggest that sort of feeling when you're about to pass out. Lens flares can be pretty tricky because most of the time you do need some kind of third-party tool or plugin to create complex lens flares. If you want to try your hand at one of these tools, we've provided some links to a few great resources below the video. And if not, you can actually create your own custom lens flares, or you can find lens flare images online to use. So once you create or load your lens flares into a video track above your footage, you'll want to change the blend mode of that clip. For lens flares, you should start with the screen blend mode. And for a little added brightness, you can also try the add blend mode. Here, we used a third-party lens flare generator, so we had the ability to control both the brightness and the size of the flare. We increased the brightness of the flare as Alex started to fall backwards into the tub, and then we simply just used a crossfade into a layer of white video to create a bright fade to white. If you're not using a third-party lens flare tool, and you don't have a specific built-in control to increase the brightness or the size of the flare, you can always just apply a standard brightness effect on the flare image or video that you're using, and then increase its brightness that way. And for sizing, you can simply scale the layer up or down and then keyframe that movement. Also, you can add a subtle blur to your lens flare as you scale it up so that it isn't as harsh. In our next shot, we avoided the lens flares and instead opted for some overlays of shimmering light. You can find tons of different film burns, light leaks, and various overlays online, or of course you can always create your own. And again, check out below the video for some links to resources that we recommend. The key to creating good overlays is to use a black backdrop. In order to most effectively use an overlay, you'll want to change its blend mode to either screen or add. From there, you can design the intensity of it with a simple brightness and contrast effect. And then, after that, it's all about timing. We aligned our overlays to cover the shot at just the right moments, with little flashes sometimes getting in the way too much, and others giving you just enough room to see Alex. Once you have these in your timeline, it's very easy to simply slide them around until you find the right moments. The rest of the shots in our sequence use a combination of flares and, of course, overlays. Sometimes combining overlays with flares can help hide the edits and give a feeling of connectivity between the different angles, almost like flashes of memory. Alright, so our third flashback style is all about color grading and the things that you can do in the color suite. Let's take a look.
$223.
In this example, our first shot of Alex in the tub is colored in a very neutral gray and desaturated look. This can be very easily achieved by using a combination of basic color correction effects to push more blue and green into the image, and then remove some of the reds and the yellows. Then you can use your desaturation or tint effect to make the image grayscale or black and white. This effect is dialed down heavily, only taking out about 10 to 15% of the color. This particular color grade would work pretty well for all of our present day scenes in the film, kind of giving a cold, desaturated feel to them so that the audiences know exactly what time period they're in. And of course, once you entered a flashback, the color would change dramatically. In this image from the flashback, the color is much warmer. The colors are more vibrant, and there's even a bit of glow on the light on Alex's face. To create this look, you'll want to once again use your color correction effect. You'll want to push a little bit more orange and a little bit more yellow into the image, without being too aggressive. We want the color to feel natural, so it's just a few micro adjustments here. Now to create the glow. The technique for creating a glowing effect will be different from one software to another, but at its core, a glow is created in this way, whether you do it manually by hand or whether you have an effect that does this for you automatically. First, you'd need to duplicate the shot onto the next video track. You'll apply a color correction effect along with a desaturation effect. First, desaturate the image so that it's completely black and white. This should be the first effect on your clip. Next, increase the contrast so that your image is sharp black and white. You can adjust the brightness to isolate the bright areas of the image like this. Now, apply a tint or colorizing effect. The goal is to add just a bit of color into the image, something that generally matches the tone of the bright areas that you plan to glow. In our case, I'll make it slightly yellow. And finally, you'll want to layer on a blur effect and blur it out something like this. Now, you simply set this layer to the screen blend mode. Once you see how it looks composited onto your original image, you can begin to dial and tweak the settings until you have something that's desirable. Remember to be subtle. If you go too far, your audience is going to notice it and it's going to end up being distracting. If you are using a compositing software, something like After Effects, you can get even more complex with your glow creating and blend various colors together, as you see here. We have our base layer of Alex, then we have our first glow, which is light blue, then we have a red glow, which is slightly less noticeable, and each of these glows has been stretched out in different ways, and then they've been composited together with the screen blend mode. You can get very creative with your glows and try out various things to find the right look. Okay, so our fourth and final look is a bit extreme, and it's probably not going to work for every occasion, but we're going to use it just for fun, and we're going to try to make an old film look. So let's give it a shot, and let's apply this look to the shot of Alex underwater. It's a bit goofy for our scenario because it's not like Alex's flashbacks take place in the early 1900s, but in your own film projects, you might have the need to create a flashback that does look like this. So let's break down what makes it work. First, we created a uniquely feathered edge to the frame with some randomness, some jaggedness, and inconsistencies. Next, we created some custom-made film scratches, which you can see here. And then we added some film grain on top of the image, and we're pretty heavy-handed with it. The last two things we did were some color correction to give the image an older film look, and we added some keyframes to the position of the layer to give it a little bit of shakiness like it was on an old projector. So let's take a look at how we constructed each one of these. First, the feathered edge. You could do this a number of different ways. First, if you don't have much experience using a handful of effects in your software, you could always find an image online to put on top of your footage. Most stock footage websites are going to have some kind of old film overlay that you can use. If you want to create something like this from scratch, the concept is actually pretty simple. First, create a layer in which you can punch a hole in the center of, feather the edges of your mask, and then use an effect in your software that roughens up the edges. In the case of After Effects, that's actually called roughen edges. So create something that looks sort of like this. Now, you want to blur the layer so that your rough edges aren't so sharp. And of course, you can squash or stretch the various blurs as desired until you find the right look. You can even manually draw some inconsistencies in the mask so that it has a little bit of a unique shape. Once that's done, you can move on to creating film scratches. You don't need any special effects or plugins to create this. If you take a look at this frame by frame, you'll see that the film scratches are actually very simple. They're just long, thin, vertical lines that are going to appear randomly. Simply just create a thin vertical line, place several of them in your frame, and then move to the next frame and place more of them. Do this for 24 frames, and then copy and repeat. The cycle won't really be noticeable since it's going to be going so quickly. If you want to use After Effects to do this, a quick way to create this would be to use CC Rainfall. By tweaking a few settings, you can very quickly create vertical lines that repeat. So now you'll need some film grain. And it's possible that your software has a built-in grain effect. And if you do, that's great. Simply just add that to your footage. If not, you'll probably need to find some film grain online. And of course, pretty much any stock footage website is going to have some good examples of that. When applying an overlay layer of film grain, the blend mode that you'll want to use to composite into your footage is Multiply. To put the finishing touches on this look, you'll just want to color correct your footage a little bit. For this, there are no hard and fast rules. You want to come up with a look that reads as old film, typically by desaturating the image, pushing a lot more yellow into it, and then adding significant amounts of contrast. Just be careful not to overdo it, of course, because the image still needs to be visible. All right, and then lastly, you just want to give the shot a little bit of random wiggle. One way to go about doing this is to simply make a keyframe on every frame and then manually raise and lower the position to random values. You can again just do this for 24 frames, then copy it and paste it over and over again. So there you have it, 4 completely unique visual styles that you can craft by hand and customize as needed for your flashback scenes. Sometimes you might just use one of these styles, while other times you might borrow a little bit from each. Just remember, it's important to be subtle and to follow the story. Over-stylizing something can be very distracting to a viewer. Less is almost always more. If you're doing a good job of telling the story, the choice to even stylize something in the first place is going to be up to you. And a little bit of stylization is going to go a long way. This, by the way, is far too much.